Hey guys, I think you're really going to enjoy this video, but I do want to let you know that it is a little bit of a different video. For the first time, I think, on this channel, I'm interviewing someone who is not a Christian, but he loves church. And that is fascinating to me. And that's what we talk about in this video. But if hearing people express opinions that are kind of, against what you believe just makes you uncomfortable in your faith, and you know what? That's fine. Like, this video just might not be for you. But if you love interesting conversations about church and about theology and trying to relate to people who disagree with you and how we can live in a world where people have all different types of opinions and do so well, I think you'll really enjoy this video. Jared is super thoughtful, super interesting guy, and I had a great time with it, and I think you will too. Anyway, here's the video. Well, Jared, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, Austin, man, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've been really looking forward to this. I stumbled across your YouTube channel, Heliocentric, which will be linked down below, and you've got this fascinating series called Atheist Church Audit, which I've just devoured so many of the episodes and thought, I've got to talk to this guy. We're going to have a good time with it, and that's what we're going to do. But I want to start just with this idea of, Jared, like, there's a lot of things to do on a Sunday morning. It was late into my life till I even realized that for a lot of people, the 2 days on the weekend are just the same. Like, you get 2 Saturdays. Um,
Yeah.
but as an atheist, you still choose to go to church a lot of Sundays, and you make videos about your experience and reflect on that. What led you to start doing that?
I mean, truthfully, I'm just bored, you know?
Yeah, nothing better to do on a Sunday.
Atheists don't have community. And so even as an atheist, you're just clamoring to get back in. No, I feel like I should preface all of this by saying, like, I'm an atheist who regularly goes to church. I don't like church. It's still boring. Like all of the normal, complaints that you hear from Christians to Mormons to everywhere in between. They're like, yeah, like if I'm honest, it's like kind of boring, and the pastor's sermon is puts me to sleep sometimes. And I feel the exact same way. I'm not there like in the pew, on the edge of my seat. But yeah, I don't know. Um, I started doing this over a decade ago. Uh, when I was quick down and dirty of my story, I became a Christian at 13, went through a Pentecostal pseudo seminary from the ages of 18 to 21, then graduated from Wheaton College with my undergrad at 25. So I deconverted at the age of 23. But when I was in my pseudo seminary, I I don't know where I got it in my head of like, oh, I want to um, hopscotch across churches and like, see what all these other churches are going on about and just kind of like compare and contrast. Um, so there was that angle of it of just kind of like genuine curiosity. Like there's a church on every street corner. Like, what are these people talking about? But then also there was an apologetic angle to it where I was actively preaching the gospel and I was like, well, I want to be able to um, properly convey the gospel to these people. And if they have objections to the gospel, I want to understand them thoroughly and genuinely and give a truthful, honest rebuttal to those criticisms of the gospel. I wanted to be a 19-year-old American Irenaeus. Um, and so that was my goal. I remember being like 19. Um, and for some reason, I got it in my head that like I wanted to go and study the Nation of Islam. So I knocked on the door of their mosque, and this uh, bouncer at the door tells me like, "Yeah, you're not coming in." Well, it was the pastor came out and told me like, "Hey, man, we can't let you inside here." It was funny. So yeah, I've been church hopping for a long time. I think after my deconversion, it always felt like Christianity was a culture to me as well, not just a faith, but like there's a community here that I feel like I'm always going to be stuck with. I still find Christian memes to be funny. Uh, I don't know, all of it. So with the churches, it's now sort of like I don't know. I mean, this almost feels like a cop out, but like I don't know why I do this. Um, it's interesting. And I think that like comparing and contrasting these wildly different permutations of Christianity is fascinating. And I have a lot of fun talking to new and weird people and hearing about their weird, strange beliefs. Um, then I enjoy it.
Yeah.
So I wish I could say that there was some, deep, pensive, philosophical reason behind it, but I'm just kind of having fun, man.
I think if we dig enough layers down on most of our answers, like why do we do stuff? Like, I don't know, we enjoy it. And I think it's, worth noting that, you get, especially, I think it can be surprising for people that maybe like even on the academic side, they think like everyone who studies the Bible or who's in like religious studies or theology, like they all must just be like super passionate about their faith. But there's also
Yeah.
just a lot of people that find these questions really interesting. I mean, they are kind of some of the biggest questions to ask, right? And there's whole cultures built around it, like you talked about, and subcultures and Reddits
Yeah.
and subreddits for all this stuff. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable to just enjoy it in its own kind of fascinating way. But
Yeah.
kind of along those lines, I want to ask, it seems to me that you get a lot of Christians watching your videos because there's something fun about kind of getting to
Yeah.
hear like an outsider perspective, especially probably on some of the more niche communities too that you go into. And within that, I'm sure you hear all different types of responses from people about what you're doing. But what do you think is like something that people often misunderstand of what you're doing, specifically with the Atheist Church Audits?
If I'm honest, I feel like people have understood it really well.
Good.
I'm so like grateful to say that the bulk of the comments that I get are something along the lines of like, well, I didn't know what to think about this when I clicked on this video, you being an atheist and all, but as a Christian, I actually kind of like this. And, then from there, people watch a couple of my videos and they kind of get the gist of what I'm doing. Um, and yeah, I think being like upfront and honest with myself about like, yeah, I don't really know why I'm doing this. And I have fun putting it out there. I have fun making memes and, being manic. Uh, but shoot, I just totally lost my train of thought. Um, what was your question?
Yeah, no, I was just asking what people misunderstand about it. And I guess maybe one thing I'd
Yeah.
be curious is like you mentioned in I think it was when you went to the atheist church actually, or atheist assembly. I think you called it church in the title and then said that's not what they call it. But so whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
Um, but you had a funny piece in there of like all the ortho bros praying for your conversion. Do you get a lot of that? Like, oh, Jared's right there. Like we're reeling him in. He's almost back.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. How do I tie this in? So I've been thinking about this video for a while that I think would be really fun to have like a tier list of the evangelical efforts that I get in my comments, and like rating them like, okay, this person, QWERTY keyboard warrior 112 said, repent for the kingdom is nigh. And like, okay, that's probably like a D tier. But, this one person who like, shared their testimony and like, hey, I'm a paraplegic and like, here's how Christ changed my world. Like, wow, that's impactful. That's an A plus. Um, so yes, I do definitely have a lot of people um, praying for my conversion, and I'm okay with that. Like um, because from the Christian perspective, Christ is the ultimate joy, and people want to share that with me. I would be offended if you didn't want to share it with me. Um, there are really good ways that people have shared the gospel with me, and there are really piss poor ways that people have tried to share the gospel with me. I've been pleasantly surprised though, because anyone who even clicks on my video is probably going to be a little bit more open minded. And the vast majority of people who reach out to me, they know my deal. Like they know that I didn't walk away from the faith because I just was mad at God because he disavows homosexuality or because he told me that I couldn't like snort my body weight in cocaine, like whatever, whatever some, Christian wants to kind of strawman my deconversion as. It's like, no, I had genuine concerns about the authenticity of the biblical witness, the historical resurrection, and all of these things led me to say, no, I don't believe that this is true. And most pastors who have reached out to me have been really chill. They've been really wonderful. I can say I'm friends now with a Catholic priest. I'm friends with a military chaplain who has kind of a Baptist background, and I will say that, like, people who want to witness to me, there's always like the temptation to belabor the point, and don't do that. That's lame. And I feel like the people who are most prone to do that are people who are young or young in their faith. That's my experience. People who are older, pastors, clergy, they tend to get it a little bit more. And those are the conversations that I enjoy having more. Yeah. You asked about misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is a misunderstanding, but when I started this channel, I was really anticipating kickback from two groups. And the topic of criticism I was expecting was to be my atheism, right? So I was fully ready for atheists to attack me and say, "You're not really an atheist. You're too nice to those Christians." And then I was also, on the other hand, expecting Christians to say, "You're not really an atheist. You're too nice to us Christians." And to my shock and amazement, I've never gotten a single comment or message from an atheist questioning the authenticity of my atheism. It's never happened. It's never come up a single time. Now, to be fair, probably 90% of my audience at this point is Christian, somewhere between 75% and 90. So, take that with a grain of salt. But I get comments and messages, all the time of people wanting to question the authenticity of my atheism. And that takes a few different permutations, takes a few different forms. Probably the most benevolent form is when people say something like, "Jared, you talk about the gospel in such glowing terms. I think that deep down you still really believe this." I think that that's, a valid statement to make. It's one that I don't believe is true, unfortunately. But like, totally understand where you're coming from with that. The more rude and sinister side of it is when people start attacking atheism in general and say, like, this is an incoherent worldview, there's no such thing as a real atheist, and they just kind of spout off talking points or like debate points rather than trying to like engage with my worldview, ask questions about my worldview, because I have answers to most of those kinds of criticisms. But when you just kind of copy and paste apologetic, slam dunks in the comments, it's rude and it's condescending. And I hope that I don't ever treat Christians or any other religious group with that much of like a clickbait dismissiveness. I'm sure I will, and I'll have to apologize for it later. But yeah.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because even though we come at this from different perspectives, I think there's so much overlap in our own experiences online, because I started on YouTube as, a Protestant making videos about going to Catholic and Orthodox churches. And so it's kind of, within the broader Christian church, I guess, depending on who you ask and how strictly they draw those lines, which has been an interesting thing to navigate. But I get so many similar comments, just in a kind of a slightly different sphere. Like all the time I'll get people saying like, "Okay, deep down, like, you're really Catholic though, right? Like, let's be honest here." Right. Or on the other hand, you get those kind of copy paste arguments of like, what you believe is incoherent. And something that always strikes me about the kind of copy paste side of things is like, anytime you think you have a slam dunk argument against a belief that's been held for a quite long time by quite smart people, like, you probably just don't understand the other side. Like, when your argument amounts to like, the other people must be ignorant or stupid, it's generally not productive and also generally not well thought out. It's like, well, there's smart people, and I think it's absolutely the same on kind of the Christian atheist thing of like, if you think you've destroyed atheism in like 2 sentences, like you probably don't understand the atheist position, and same for vice versa, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I would be the first to very confidently say there are some brilliant Christian apologists that give me pause, right? Um, and I hope that Christians would, yeah, have the charity to be able to say the same thing about my beliefs, even if it's just for the sake of having a polite conversation. It makes things a lot easier. But no, I mean, what you said was very poignant. My friend pointed this out, and I think that this is fascinating, that there's kind of a weird phenomenon in conspiratorial thinking, um, and probably just thinking in general. But with conspiracy theorists in particular, they tend to know more about their fixation, whether they think that vaccines cause autism, or whether they think the moon landing didn't happen, Bigfoot, whatever it is. They tend to know more about that specific field, like the general field of astronomy, more so than the average person. And the reason is they have to have ready to go arguments to combat the like very low hanging fruit arguments that people make about the moon landing. Or, I'm just going to run with the moon landing example. Um, you say like, the moon landing happened, and a conspiracy theorist says, no, it didn't. And you're like, well, yeah, it did. Like, we have pictures. And they're like, well, did you know that the pictures were taken on this kind of camera, which wasn't invented until 3 years later? And then, NASA has stitched together these elements, and then this, and these kinds of rockets weren't able to propulse at this. And it's like, how do you know this much? And it's like they have to know a little bit more than the average person in order to defend the face value of their arguments. And so, you know, the thing that feel like I have to remind myself all the time is whenever I see something and I don't understand it, even if it like regardless of what it is, like, man, why are there so many potholes in the road? Somebody should fix those potholes. It's probably some idiot who just like forgot to do it. Just assume that like any question that you have, it's probably as complicated as the most complicated thing you know. If you're like an expert bodybuilder and you know a ton about bodybuilding, and then you come across a question of like, why do religious people believe this bullshit? Just assume that it's as complicated as pharmacology and muscle recovery. If you're, an expert in botany and you're like, man, why do philosophers spend all day like, pontificating about how many angels can dance on the pin of a needle? Just assume it's as complicated as, the cell structure of cannabis or whatever. And that will lead you to deeper questions and more humble and honest exploration.
That's really good. Yeah. I've often thought that people who take that kind of line, who are just interested in things and are curious, like interested people are the most interesting people. Like they ask the questions
Mm.
that are worth kind of sitting down. And another thing I've often had to remind myself is that anytime I find myself saying, I just don't understand how anyone could believe whatever, fill in the blank. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a statement about me. It's not about them, right? Like
yeah,
in that
yeah.
statement, I'm saying I don't understand, which means I have something to learn. Like, and sure, are there people out there who just believe silly things? Yeah, but I find life is more enjoyable. You have better conversations and you learn a whole lot more when you
Mhm.
just kind of go in with the default of like, these people probably aren't bad and they're probably not stupid. And so maybe I
Right.
have something to learn from them. It doesn't mean they're right. I mean, it
Yeah.
could, they might be right, but it probably means that they know something I don't. And by being
Hmm.
curious about it, I can probably learn a lot more and get to know them on a deeper level too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree completely.
And I
That's
think
wild.
that's what makes your series so interesting is that you go into it with curiosity to learn about these groups. But I think you also kind of manage to balance two things where you're curious, but that doesn't mean that you think they're all like equally good either. Like you'll come down hard
Right.
on some of these and be like, this is a cult. Like this is bad. Run away. Like don't
Yeah.
do not pass go. Um, and so I'd be curious as you're going in, and this is going to be a high level question, but
Mhm.
like what makes a church good? Like, what are you looking at? And what, as someone who doesn't believe in God, but has, I think, some appreciation for church, like, what makes a good church?
It's really hard. And kind of bird's eye view, I don't know that I've ever been inside of a good church. But I know that I've been inside of several very, very, very bad churches, if that makes sense. And so, and I don't want to, I should say I haven't been inside of a perfect church. I've been inside of a lot of amazing, incredible churches. And sometimes those amazing, incredible churches look very different from each other, right? I went to one of my first videos was going to a biker church where like all these Baptists got together on their Harleys and, filled it a little auditorium. And it was actually really cool. And I really liked it and I had a great time. I've been to Pentecostal churches that I love. I've been to Eastern Orthodox churches that I love, and I've been to Catholic churches that I love. And so I think that I would be amiss if I were to say like, oh, I want this thing and that thing. It's like I think that you can do church in a lot of different ways and do it well. But then obviously, there's pros and cons. There's give and take with every denomination, right? I love the pensive contemplation of Catholics, but then on the other hand, I hate the kind of rigidity of it that it has sometimes. I love the spontaneity of charismatics, but then sometimes it's very easy for them to just fall off the deep end into just pure hysteria. I love the scrupulosity of Presbyterians, but then sometimes they can get a little anal retentive, And so like there's a constant balancing act that happens throughout all of these churches. And I like kind of pointing that out and saying like, hey, this is cool. This is good. Maybe work on this. The thing where I draw the line though, is like, there are churches that are engaging in bad practices or dangerous practices that it's not just a difference of opinion or theology. It's like, no, this is going to end badly. And history has shown that other cults have run that out. And it's like, there needs to be an intervention immediately. And as for me, who is an atheist, but I still just care about people, it's like there are some of these groups that I'm investigating where it's like they've just ruined lives. And in some cases, they have blood on their hands. I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses literally have blood on their hands with not allowing blood transfusions. And it's over the stupidest verses. I'm going to make myself like red in the face, angry if I think about it too long. Do you know where they get that from? Pop quiz.
I don't, which is going to be bad. Like I should probably get a refund on my theology degrees. I mean, it has to do it in the Old Testament with like, well, actually, I'll just not step in it and let you tell me. We can have this like atheist educating the Christian. This is great.
So they get the blood doctrine from a couple of passages in the Old Testament that talk about not eating blood, right?
Okay.
And then in the New Testament, I forget if it's James or Peter, one of the apostles in I think Acts 15, he writes this letter to the other apostles and says, it felt good to us brothers to not burden you with any other stipulation, or however he phrases it.
Like the Jerusalem Council here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so he says, stay away from fornication, meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood. And it's like, that's where you got that from. Like, if I were to be that anal about like a specific word in the Bible and just, copy and pasting it to, some random thing in the 21st century, if there was like a prohibition on, I don't know, swords, right, in the New Testament, right? Put enough of this. We don't go buy some swords. No, enough of that. We don't need any swords. But in 2024, there was a company started called Sword LLC, and God said, don't have anything to do with swords. That's not what it's talking about. And the fact that they're refusing to read the Bible in its context and like say, no, this is not what God intended. God did not intend for you to let your children die because of you misappropriating this verse. Sorry, it kills me. I did not intend to get on this soapbox today, but here we are.
No, I appreciate it. And so, I mean, it seems like the the thing is like, is this harmful to people? Is maybe one of the main questions you're asking,
Yeah.
right? And I guess kind of implicit in that, the way that you've answered that, it seems, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so push back on me, that you wouldn't see like church as just intrinsically harmful, like church just qua church.
No,
Okay.
no.
But so you're looking at what expressions of church are specifically harmful to people, and that could be things like not getting access to medical care, or I can't remember what it was. It was like House of Prayer for All People, or
Yeah,
which, yeah,
yeah.
I watched those ones,
Tupac.
and where you're thinking of and I mean this can break my heart thinking about it too, of like these people who are living like absolutely paycheck to paycheck and then are being like just squeezed for every last penny they have.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I imagine that would also fall into the category of like, this isn't okay, this isn't good for people.
Right, right. So, even with, I want to speak out of both sides of my mouth,
Yeah.
and I want to say, like, I'll start by praising them, because I think that for all of the faults of the United House of Prayer, they actually have a really beautiful culture that I almost wish could be salvaged. It's this really unique expression of like Black church culture that I think is so cool and so fascinating, and they've got their own traditions and customs and sayings and phrases, and it's really cool. And I wish that it didn't come at the price of people being ostracized by their friends and family, for leaving. And I wish that it didn't come at the expense of people having to pay $8,000 annually to be under the spiritual protection of their bishop. That's a thing that I didn't mention in the videos. They have a thing called Daddy's Club, uh, which, great name. I love it, right?
The
Um,
branding.
it's so on point. Um, if you want to be in Daddy's special club, receive his spiritual protection, it comes with a pin, so you can plop it on your chest and say, "I'm under sweet Daddy Cunningham." That costs $8,000 a year, and that's in addition to all of the other expenses that you have to pay as a churchgoer there. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those where it's like, you guys have so much crap, and it breaks my heart because it's in the middle of some stuff that's kind of beautiful. Uh, so yeah, yeah, and that's just one of many problems that they have, but that's an easy thing to point to.
Sure. And as you said, like you've never been to a perfect church, but that doesn't keep us from
Right.
being able to say like, when things are harmful, I think both, whether you're a Christian, you're not a Christian, we should be able to look at things and be like, this isn't good, and this is hurting
Yeah.
people. um, Something that's interesting to me is that within even kind of like the atheist online community, and I'm thinking specifically of people like Alex O'Connor. um, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Yeah.
Oh, he's my hero.
Oh, okay. um,
Out of all of the public intellectuals that I know, he's maybe the only one that I actively look up to. Like,
Interesting.
huge fanboy.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about that because I've watched a ton of Alex O'Connor and I really respect his stuff as well. What draws you to
Yeah,
Alex O'Connor?
man, he's not a prick. That's a
Good
huge
first
part of
step.
it. Um, the way that he is able to so articulately just unravel an argument and cut through the fluff and say, here's the crux of what we're talking about. He is a master at that, and it is so admirable. Like, and sometimes he'll make allegories and allusions, and it's like, I've been looking for a way to phrase that for years, and he finally gave me the language to talk about it. um I also, this is maybe like kind of meta. I've loved his progress
Mm.
as a YouTuber. Um, when he started, he seemed like he was kind of part and parcel of the other, um, new atheists on the YouTubes. And, I just kind of like, watched a couple of his videos here and there, maybe even when I was still, excuse me, a Christian. And I just wasn't super impressed. And then I think he also got really into veganism,
Mhm.
and which I think is a perfectly valid, philosophically consistent thing to do. If you believe that life is worth saving, then why not animal life? Uh, and so I think he pursued that really well. And I think at the time, maybe he was still a little bit wet behind the ears. He was still kind of in cage stage. And from what I understand from hearing him speak about it, it sounds like he was a vegan for several years and, was maybe a little bit snarky. And then eventually he had some health problems and said, well, my philosophy demands this of me, but I can't do it anymore. And so he started eating meat again. And I think that mellowed him out a lot, and made him, yeah, I don't know, more like he's not a dogmatist anymore, right? He doesn't have to, live out this lifestyle. And I think he's comfortable with saying, like, yeah, I'm kind of inconsistent with this and it makes me a little uncomfortable. And I love the humility in that. Um, and so I also love just the fact that he has like changed in my mind is kind of a beautiful thing because we live in the era of like YouTube takedown videos, which are just, they break my heart every time I see one. It's like I don't want anyone to, to be publicly crucified, even if they have done like things on YouTube or in real life. Certainly there's times where like, yeah, people need to be called out on things. But I'll often see these videos where the headline is like, how Joe Schmo 363 lost all of his subscribers and became an absolute loser. And something about that is so definitive. It's like, well, is he dead? No, his story is still going on. And like maybe in 10 years, he's going to be like the coolest fucking kid on the block. Maybe in 3 years, he's going to be like somebody that you actually look up to and admire. Um, and so I hate just the idea of like coldly dismissing people as like, oh, their story's over. Um, and to my Christians, if I could play that card, it seems counterintuitive to the gospel, which is a story of redemption. Um, and so yeah, I like it when people make comebacks and are able to reinvent themselves.
It really is fascinating to me because he was like very big into veganism. He was even, I think, beginning to describe himself less as like an atheist kind of, you know, intellectual, if you will, and more of a vegan and animal rights advocate. Like that was kind of the lane he was running in. And then he had this, kind of very public, like, hey, like this is where I'm at. Like you said, like that kind of tension of, I know my philosophy led me here, but just as a human, this is where I'm going. And I mean,
Yeah,
sure, he got a lot of pushback. I remember seeing the community post on YouTube,
yeah,
but his channel has blown up after that. Like, and I'm not saying it's because of that, but I think it is a wonderful thing that he was able to have this like, hey, like, yeah, I'm just gonna say like you might be following me for this and I'm not going in that direction anymore. And I know that might break your heart because this might be something you're really into. And people haven't, it wasn't the death of him on the internet, because we live in such kind of a, like cancel culture can be a bit of a, controversial thing, but we certainly live in the era, if you will, of like the takedown videos and whatnot. And so to be able to see that has been interesting. And the mellowing out, I think, is spot on. And I think there's this mellowing out in how he approaches Christianity and the church, which I think might have some overlap with you as well. Although I'd be interested if you see things maybe differently or not than him. But especially in some of his more recent stuff, he seems to be kind of moving in the direction of like, I don't believe this is true. And some of it I do think is bad, speaking for Alex.
Mhm.
But like having some place of like, I think religion is probably like on balance good for society. It there's this sense of like there's kind of a cohesive thing, and like,
Sure.
I've heard people asking like, will you teach your kids that like there is no God? And he's like, I'd probably just say like, it's complicated, and like look into it. And I see more and more kind of within the atheism that I run across online of I don't believe this, and some of it I think's bad,
Hmm.
and I might think it's just patently untrue, but like maybe throwing out the church with it, like I don't know, I'd kind of still like there to be pretty churches around. Like I'd like the beautiful music, like, and maybe it's good for the kids and for everyone else that can convince themselves of this. I guess, how do you approach that question of like, is church good for society, and if it is that enough of a reason to keep it around?
I guess it's hard. It's hard for me to say um, whether it's good or not. Um, in my mind, I don't even really think about it in those terms. In my mind, it's sort of like, well, whether or not I think it's good, I think it's going to keep happening. Um, I think that it's like religion's not going anywhere anytime soon until we have, superhumans that have merged with artificial intelligence and, create some sci-fi dystopia.
It's like five
Um,
years from now. I'm just kidding.
yeah, yeah, give or take. Um, no, but I think like, if you're going to hang out with like-minded religious people every Sunday, how do you do it well, and how do you do it not so well? And like, yeah, so thinking about myself, like, has my life improved or not improved since deconverting? Well, in some ways, it's improved a lot. In other ways, it feels like, uh, out of the cauldron into the fire kind of thing. Um, but then, like, going to church now, as an atheist who actively goes to church, do the churches that I go to better my life? Not really. Um, they better my life because it gives me something to talk about. It gives me like, fun things to tell my friends about. Um, but I don't go and ever like hear a sermon and get bettered from it. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think for some people that's the only thing they have in their life, and that's a big deal. I definitely knew some sweet elderly church ladies who like that's their whole world, and that's a big deal. Um, I'm a little reluctant to say that like there couldn't be a secular equivalent of that. It's just like I don't know, and I kind of like get queasy or squeamish, like trying to say like, oh well, is it good for society or bad for society? That feels like too complicated of a topic to like give any sort of coherent answer to.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fine. And the kind of odd thing that YouTube does, and like having interviews and platforms of whatever size, is that it makes it seem as though like our opinions on these questions actually matter, like as though there's going to be people that ask us like, so is this good or not, like because you get to pull the plug on it, like as you
Yeah,
say, it kind of is. I think it's good, but the fact that I think it's good isn't going to perpetuate it, and if you thought it was bad, it also isn't going to kind of tear the rug out from the church. But there are interesting questions. I mean, this is philosophy,
yeah,
right? And so we ask questions
right.
that we have no business actually answering. But you mentioned this idea of a secular equivalent, and I think this is an intriguing topic to me. We already mentioned the kind of Sunday assembly you went to. I think that was the name of it,
Yeah, yeah,
the Atheist Church, if you will. Something that came out to me, and that which was really intriguing, is that it seemed that Sunday assembly was able to kind of scratch the itch of a lot of things that church does, if you will, like
yeah.
sense of community, that sense of maybe some inspiration, of connectedness, of all of these things. And I don't want to put words into your mouth again, so if this is incorrect, please tell me. And maybe this was just something people were saying in the comments, but I think there was that sense of like transcendence that was maybe not
Yeah,
quite there. And I
yeah.
wonder what you make of that. Like, could we, is transcendence necessary, or is it like it was a nice to have, but if we had secular equivalents and they had everything else except transcendence, that'll work?
So some of my atheist friends will hate me for this. In talking to, one of my atheist friends from like the local Raleigh atheist meetup, he was really passionate about this idea of like, but isn't humanity, right? This, incredible epoch of the sapient experience, isn't that amazing? It's the universe becoming conscious of itself inside of our bodies, right? Inside of our brains. Um, and I like that. I think that's really cool. It excites me. Um, but I'm not just an atheist. I'm also a nihilist. And, uh, as a nihilist, it's like I personally like it. I personally see how it's beautiful, but I don't believe in transcendence. I don't believe that there's anything happening behind the curtain. I think the cold, hard fact of biology and neurology is all there is. And so, like, if this sprouts awe and wonder in you, awesome, great. Um, but when you tell me that this is the right way to view the universe, or how you ought to view things, that's when I pump the brakes a little bit.
That makes sense. And do you see that desire for transcendence? I mean, it's essentially, I imagine, your idea, like it's a desire for something that doesn't exist. It's this kind of
Right.
odd, quirky, persistent desire. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I guess, do you think it's just one of those things where we probably have evolved it for some reason that was beneficial in some ways, but it doesn't really latch on to anything. Like we're just kind of we're seeking something, and it's just part of being human. That idea of transcendence, because it seems like that's one of the things that churches offer people is
Mm-hmm.
some sense of tapping into that.
One of my best friends, he and I converted together and we deconverted together. And when I deconverted, it ruined me. I mean, it almost killed me. It was the hardest thing that I've ever had to go through. And when he deconverted, he felt a lot of that as well. I think he more so felt anger, towards his religious community that didn't place more emphasis on like scientific education. He felt like he missed out on some opportunities that he could have had he been raised in a secular home. And I think that both of those are valid things to think and feel. But when it came to the question of, like, well, dude, we had these incredible, ecstatic religious experiences together. I remember praying with you in your bedroom and, we were both sobbing and like lifting our hands and like, embracing the love of Jesus. What do you make of that? Because to me, it felt like an incredible loss to say that, yeah, it was just stuff in my head. And to him, it was like, you mean all of that was stuff inside of me? All of that experience, that incredible awe and transcendence that I felt, that was all sustained by 86 billion neurons inside my head. That's crazy. And for him, it was beautiful. It elevated
Mm.
his own sense of self that he was able to, kind of whip himself into that kind of awe. Um, so there's different ways to think about it. And I've also talked to some atheists who might say something to the effect of like, um, I think probably a valid atheistic criticism of my stance is something like, well, Jared, Christianity baited you along with hope. How would you say it? It baited you along with a hope that wasn't there. And now you miss something that you never would have missed otherwise. Right. Because I do have some secular friends who, were raised by lesbian parents out in Portland. And like, when I talk to them, it's like they kind of scratch their head at like, yeah, but why would you want to like live forever or like have this crazed like divine encounter? Like, I'm just happy like spending time with my friends and family. Like, why do I need like something more than that? Um, I think that's some people's experience. It would probably be a big jump to say that that's the experience of all secular people. Um, I lived in the Netherlands for a little while, and I would say that that experience does seem at least a little bit more common of just like, yeah, I don't need this crazy, like shooting beyond the stars into the heavens kind of, out of body experience to feel fulfilled. I just like hanging out with my friends and family, and occasionally I go to the pub and like hanging out's pretty nice. Um, but as far as, weirdos like me, who have always been allured by the divine, yeah, I don't know what to make of that from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, and I wasn't necessarily. There's no gotcha at the end of this, and there's no expectation for an exhaustive answer. The
Which I
human
really
desire
appreciate.
for sure, I don't have one. Um, I just find the desire for transcendence to be fascinating, and
Yeah.
how much of our lives, I think, in some ways, could be described by our desire for transcendence, depending on how we define that. I mean, you could also maybe less romantically define it as like a desire for perpetuation past yourself, you know. Um, but it seems that
And
so
to
much,
me,
yeah,
that makes sense.
sure,
Yeah, to me, I mean, the idea of eternal life, that makes way more sense, evolutionarily speaking. Um, because creatures are, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Me and my best friend, we have this thing where like anytime that we're talking about a topic that we like don't know a whole lot about, we have to say armchair theory alert, armchair theory alert. So my armchair theory alert for this is that like creatures who have hope of survival are probably going to outlive creatures that don't, creatures who just give up and die. And so um, that's also a name of my song, one of my songs, by the way. Uh,
what hope of survival or
so
give up and die?
give up and die.
Oh, okay.
And just happy accident. So uh, if creatures have a propensity and an evolutionary advantage to believing in survival, then it seems totally feasible to me that that would extend beyond life. I want to be rich, right? And I want to be rich here in this life. What if I could be even more rich in like a super life in the afterlife? And so the fact that we've kind of evolved to think that and want that, um, would totally make sense to me in an evolutionary context.
Yeah, I suppose. I think I could also see it. This is, armchair alert as well, because it's not something I've thought a great deal about. I imagine one could say, but wouldn't nihilism lead you more? Well, I guess no. Maybe that goes with what you're saying. I guess I'll put it this way: could belief in eternal life make you embrace death more, depending on how high of credence you had in it? And I wonder if that would be bad for a species to perpetuate. Like if you're like, oh,
Hmm.
but I mean, dying isn't that important because
I see.
it's just kind of your life on this earth is a blip in the radar. The old like Francis Chan, like
Yeah.
the 2 inches of the red rope, and
What a great sermon.
right. That's something I think that draws so many people to your videos is that the evangelical and the Christian subculture so well. You speak the language fluently.
Hmm. It's a hard language to learn. Um,
Even harder to unlearn.
you're not wrong. Oh man. No, that is a good point. Yeah, I guess you could point to suicide bombers and say that like their desire for eternality has kind of been an evolutionary disadvantage. That's interesting. My hunch would be to say that like, well, maybe it's such a novel phenomenon, um, you know, being martyred for eternal glory, uh, that it hasn't had time to play out yet. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. These are very much. I wouldn't even say half baked. Like I put the cookies in the oven while the oven's still preheating. Like the beep hasn't even gone off yet. So, this
100%.
is all very provisional. But they're fascinating things to think about. I want to tap into something we just mentioned about unlearning, because you once said something in, I I think it was on that United House of Prayer videos that really stood out to me. And I don't know what my audience will make of this. They might see this as a bug and not a feature, but you
Hmm.
said that something that evangelicalism really has going for it is that you can kind of just leave, and
Yeah.
you're contrasting that with a cult, in which there is so much baggage there. But I guess I want to talk about the dynamic of you. You mentioned how on the one hand, like this was the most kind of difficult thing was losing your faith in a
Yeah.
personal way, but also it sounds like you were in a context where added on to that wasn't this like complete cult like separation from everything that's happened before. But
Right.
maybe we
Right.
could kind of talk about that a little bit of the idea that evangelicals have something going for them and that you can leave. Because I think we're seeing a lot of that in kind of deconstruction.
Yeah. You know, in talking about like general goals for my channel, um, it feels cliche to the point of being condescending to say that like I want to promote conversations or healthy dialogue, reaching across the aisle or whatever. It feels like really, I don't know, trite to say. But yes, to all that. Um, I want to show evangelicals how to do that well, how to love atheists or people who are deconverting and deconstructing, um, in a way that, like, I don't want you to feel like you have to compromise. I don't want you to feel like you have to compromise on your interpretation of scripture, but within the bounds of your worldview, how you can do that well, how you can reach out to your friends and family in love, um, how you can, continue to play Call of Duty with your best friend, and not be a turd, and try to like Jesus juke. Are you familiar with that term?
I
Is that
am.
too deep in the evangelical subculture?
No,
Okay.
I can go that deep with you.
Yeah. So,
Like 8 years of private Christian school. I did go to public school for high school, but pretty, and they're pretty deep.
perfect. Perfect. Oh, man. So, yeah, I mean, talking about people walking away, um, it's hard. It's really hard. Um, I don't even know where to begin with that one. Like, when I see the Jehovah's Witnesses, and full, I don't know, spoiler. What's the opposite of a teaser? Teaser. A full teaser for my upcoming video, which is going to be on the Jehovah's Witnesses and their disfellowshipping practices. Um, I talked to some ex-J Dubs in that video, and like their stories are gut wrenching, man. I mean, just I haven't talked to my parents in 5 years, and the one time they called me, it was for 3 minutes, and they invited me to a Kingdom Hall meeting, and then they hung up. And like, I just I can't imagine how you get there. Um, and it's like so obviously, like nobody who leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses ever comes back, right? Um, Probably I don't want to say that like none of them ever come back, because people do get disfellowshipped and then they're allowed to come back after a time of groveling. Um, but it just seems like, conversely, I hear and read about stories all the time of like, oh yeah, man, I know your type. I was an atheist for 10 years, and then the hounds of heaven got a hold of me and brought me back into the kingdom of God. And they will have like a reconversion experience. Um, and as an aside, people often, what happens with deconverts is they will leave one faith tradition and then kind of join the I don't know, like mirror opposite of whatever faith tradition they were a part of. So if
Now they
you're
all
a
become
Catholic,
Orthodox.
exactly. Well, if you're an evangelical, but if you're a Catholic, bet your ass that you're going to wind up in Elevation Church. Just whatever. Like, it feels like the same old with a new facelift. Like, wow, it's still got Jesus and the disciples, but now they're hip. Uh, That tends to be like the trend that I noticed. It's very rare that someone will like leave the Baptist church, be gone for 10 years, and then come back to the Baptist church. Sometimes it happens, but yeah. So I can't fathom why anyone would want to do that to people, other than if it's a very niche and hopefully incorrect interpretation of scripture. Um, but I mean, like, clearly it's better for evangelism if you're not a prick to the people who have left. Um, like, I think the data just shows that out. Like, people who are able to maintain friendships with Christians who have deconverted are probably more likely to eventually become Christians. Now, I think there's a little bit of a fear in there that, like, well, if I keep being friends with them, how do I know they won't drag me down with them? I think that for especially for some like younger Christians, college age, that's a super valid question. And words, my recommendation and my advice would be that some of the most authentic faith that you can have is on the precipice of doubt. And your faith should make you do things that make you doubt further. I think there's wisdom in that. So
I think there is too. And I think, I mean, there's a couple of things I want to follow up on here. The idea of, will that influence you? I think people go through different periods where maybe their faith is more impressionable than others. And maybe, people are at a point where their faith is really impressionable and they don't really know why they believe what they believe. And so
right.
they get very defensive about it. Complete aside,
Yeah.
but my theory on why politics and religion are so like things that you're not allowed to talk about is because they're subjects where people's kind of like the amount of their identity wrapped in it is
Yeah.
disproportionately high to their actual knowledge of the topics. So it's like I can't talk
Wow.
about politics because like being a Democrat or Republican is all of who I am. I don't really know anything about it, so I get really uncomfortable if you push me on it. And same with religion for a lot of people, right? Like my whole identity is in this, but I really don't know much at all about it. But I find people who maybe they've gone through a period of doubt, maybe they've gone through a period of kind of considering the other side, or they just know a lot about it. They're super comfortable talking to people who disagree with them because it's just
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's interesting to them, and they know it
On
and
that-
they enjoy those things. So that
Yeah.
was one of the things I wanted to follow up on. The other is maybe like is going to be less of like a feel good thing and more of a how do we make sense of this? A little background. So for a while, I was part of a very, I don't know how to put it. I guess like ecumenically minded, non-denominational church that was like not just like in like the hip way, like you don't have to belong to believe, but was very much like the church had like no creed. Pretty much, it was like,
Oh wow.
it's it was, hey, these people are passionate about Jesus, but it was really a group of people that had deconstructed and were trying to sort through kind of the trauma of that, but still like Jesus. It was a really
Yeah.
interesting community to be a part of. And something they would run into is all the time they would find people who would come across and say, this is exactly what church should be. I love this. Like, this doesn't have any of that pressure. Like, you're not telling me what I have to believe. This is such a breath of fresh air. I love this. And then they'd never really come back. And the thing
Hmm.
that was all, I mean, some would, but
Yeah.
that they began looking into more and more is that more dogmatic, more, shall we say, like fundamentalist or kind of also like very exclusive religious groups tend to have a lot higher engagement. So while it might be true that, like being more open-minded and not being a jerk is good statistically in a way, I think it's also true that like we see that the kind of more, I don't know, like close-fisted some people are, the
Yeah.
higher
Yeah.
the engagement rates you get of the people who are involved. And I wonder how we make sense of that because, I think some people on the outside are like, I wish we had kind of more liberal churches or we had kind of more progressive, however, whatever we mean by that.
Right.
But I mean,
Right.
if we look at that, like, it's not going well. They're dying off. Um,
Yeah.
so I wonder what you make of that.
It's It's so hard, man. Yeah, I don't know. Um, I mean, it makes me super uncomfortable. And sometimes I'll run up against things like that where it's like, oh man, I really want to, help Christians do Christianity well. And then sometimes you come across data like that, and it's like, ah, crap. I don't know what to tell you guys on this one because I
Well,
really don't want you to be like that.
and I
Um,
think we see it on YouTube too. And I think it happens on all the sides here, but like I I would bet, that if I came out tomorrow and I was like, all I'm going to make are videos like owning the libs or like about, homosexuality or this or that, like, and you just kind of like race to the fringes as much as you can,
mhm,
you'll get
mhm.
a huge audience of people that want to give to what you're doing, that rally
Yep.
behind it, that find their identity in it. Like, it
Yeah.
works. You pour fuel on that fire. And I think probably on the other side too, like if you just give people like, hey, I'm the only one that knows the truth, everyone else is dumb, like
Yeah.
people are attracted to that. Like I don't know what
Yeah.
to do with that.
I mean, I will say that, like, the sunk cost fallacy is real, right? I mean, um, cults utilize that. Like it's really hard to come to terms with the idea that the religious organization that you're a part of isn't legit when you've spent the last 20 years going and street preaching with them for 10 hours every month. You know, like um, it's like, you mean to tell me that I've wasted all this time? So when a religious organization can demand just a little bit more of you, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and you start feeling like you've invested your entire world into these people, it can be a lot harder to leave. um, I really don't like that. I really hate that. um, the other angle, if I can remember, sorry guys, it was a long day at the office. Like I'm kind of half baked right now. Not like weed baked, just like my brain is half cooked. um, Yeah, it might be totally gone from me. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, hey, the one thought was more than enough on that. And I guess it's a difficult thing, and I don't want to. People get squeamish when like you paint with too broad of a brush, and so I don't want to say that like every church that's dogmatic. I mean, I happen to like dogma, and as far as I really like theology, so I don't want to say like that's bad, but I do want to say there is this interesting dynamic of like the further and further you go, the more people you get kind of attracted to that cause. And I guess what I would love to see is just kind of a lot of reasonable thinking, and maybe reasonable thinking takes you in directions different than mine. It doesn't, you're not unreasonable if people disagree with me, but I think especially in the internet age where you can be really rewarded both monetarily and in terms of kind of fame and all of these things
Yeah.
for just trying to be the loudest voice or the most fringe voice, that we can all kind of reach across to people who disagree with us. I think, in some ways of what we're doing here, to be reminded that like, oh, okay, maybe that'll pull me back from going crazy and getting kind of too far from these things. And I think, to circle back to something you talked about of one of the things you see doing with your channel is like how do you help people who have maybe deconverted and people who still hold the faith like have good conversations and
Yeah.
understand one another. I think that doing that will help Christians from seeing people who have deconverted as ignorant or dumb or of ill will. And I think it
Right.
can help the people who have deconverted see Christians not as kind of ignorant, dumb, of ill will. That because it's
Right.
something I've found to be true is that it's really hard to hate people that you actually
Mhm.
see as people that you actually get to understand. It's when we
Yeah.
get that kind of distance between people that they don't seem human, they just seem kind of like less than, they're not intelligent enough, or they don't have the bare minimum of goodness to be a person. We start
Yeah.
treating them awfully. And so I think that goal of having people talk about these things well is really important. And I guess I'll just add for my audience, people might not like the idea of like, oh, as a Christian, I've got to have a lot of these conversations with people who deconverted, and like to go
Yeah.
back to numbers, though, like I came across a thing today that like 80% of Catholics will lose their faith in college. Like, if you have friends or if you have kids who are going to college, you got 4 kids, maybe you're a Catholic with like 10 kids, to make the math easy. That's 8 that might deconvert.
Yeah.
And it's like, you want to still talk to them. They're still your kids. Like, learning to do this well is
Yeah.
really important. And from my perspective as a Christian, would I love it if that number is lower? Absolutely. Like, I think the
Mhm.
faith at its best is good, true, and beautiful. But that doesn't we're not living in the world of ideals. We're living in the world of what is. And the fact is, like, people are leaving the faith, and we've all got to figure out, how do we talk and how do we do this well?
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that kind of breaks my heart, to hear a statistic like that. Not because I, want more people to be Christians, but because I fully understand the pain of watching someone you love walk away. And, especially for a Christian, if you believe in hell and that's a possible outcome of all this, like, that's scary and that's really anxiety inducing. And I think most atheists will look at that and say, like, well, the solution is just to get rid of the religion, and just beat it out of people. I shouldn't say that. That's not fair. To try to educate people about how the religion is false. And sometimes that's necessary. In the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses, it is so robust of, like, there is no redeeming factors here. There is nothing good about this. Um, Even their version of paradise just sounds like, like a pleasant week at the Bahamas, and then, it's boring for all of eternity. Uh, but like especially with a lot of like older people, it's like that can't be the solution to, like, beg and plead for your grandma to deconvert and become an atheist. Um, One, it's not going to happen. Like, be real. Um, Two, I don't know that at that stage of life that's giving her more than it's taking from her. Um, and I think, yeah, like, a lot of atheists don't understand the emotional turmoil that comes with losing a faith, um, that you really loved. They often know what it looks like when, like, oh yeah, I was raised in this, fringe Mormon sect, and, like, wasn't able to talk to a boy until I was 25. And in cases like that, they will quickly point out, like, oh, this is the woes of religion. Um, but it's a totally different thing to be like, no, this is the thing that, like, I woke up for every day for a decade, and then to have that just suddenly gone, and that comes with a lot of emotional turmoil. And, like, I wish that more atheists were compassionate towards that. Um, yeah, because I wouldn't wish that on a person, um, unless it's clear that, like, their own religion is really hindering their mental well-being, or they're using their religion as a bludgeon. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I don't want to kind of commit you to an idea, but I would imagine as a nihilist, you would say, for the inverse of this, okay, so if it's bad for that person, they should stop this, right? Like,
right.
it's best for them to not believe it. But I imagine the inverse is like, if religion's working for a person, if it's good for them, and from your perspective, there's not like meaning, there's not truthfulness in this, but if it's working for them, I mean, but it's not true, is it still worth going with it? Because what's the value of, like, I mean, it all kind of
Yeah.
equals out in the end. So if it's working for you, keep going, right?
Generally, yeah. And I mean, that's why I'm not out to dismantle people's faith. Whether that's not just like Christians that I'm nice to. If someone's like a Muslim and they really love Islam and they're super all about it, I'm not out to, like, make them deconvert. Um, if they have a faith that's, like, rooted in transcendence and rooted in loving your neighbor and all of that, I always have to make the like disclaimer, that I'm not a de facto advocate for like hippy dippy Jesus either. I don't think that, like, when I say that, people think like, oh, so you're like okay with progressive Christians but not conservative Christians. And no, I think you can be a conservative Christian who, believes the inerrancy of the Bible and still be someone who's rooted in the transcendence of God and the love of Christ. So yeah. Um, Sorry, what was your
Well,
question?
no, I'll just add there that it's fascinating to me that if you get the response from Christians of like, if you say like, hey, if it's good for people, then they can keep doing it, that they assume that it's like, oh, this is some like liberal hippy dippy Christianity. But at
Right.
least from my perspective, and maybe I'm fringe here, but like, I would like to think that, if you think that conservative Christianity is true, it would also be in some sense good for people. I mean, that's essentially where I would
Yeah.
come from.
Yeah.
And so I think when people kind of say, oh, so if you think it's good for people, it's got to be this like liberal Christianity, people probably want to try to like square that circle in their own beliefs of
Right.
like, are you, I mean, maybe people just think that what's true isn't necessarily what's good, but I think
Yeah.
it would be really, really great news if what was true was also good for people. Um, so it's
Yeah.
just an interesting observation that people would respond in that way.
I think that if your Christianity is, solely based on the austere passages in the Bible, um, and your entire life is just suffering and wallowing at the foot of the cross and misery. If there is no joy of the Lord, if there is no fellowship among brothers, if there is no rejoicing and jubilation, I think you need to rethink things. You probably need to go back to the scriptures.
Absolutely. Jared, this has been so fun. I wanna just land the plane with one final question. And again, the links to all your stuff will be in the description. But if you could go back and talk to kind of your Christian self, what is one thing that you wish you could tell that person about talking to atheists or people who have deconverted, having been on the other side of that now?
That's a curveball, man.
That wasn't in the notes, people.
What would I say to my former self? Be harder on yourself than you are on other people, and don't be so hard on yourself.
That's good advice. Jared, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Austin, thanks so much for having me, man.